Welcome back to our New Voices online talk series on women in the history of analytic philosophy and philosophy of science. This winter term talk series is organized in collaboration with Dr. Andreas Vrahimis from the University of Cyprus. Thanks a lot, Andreas. And today's talk is held by Dr. Julia Franke-Reddig. Julia Franke-Reddig, University of Siegen and University of Geneva, studied logic, philosophy, and social sciences in Leipzig. In 2023, she received her PhD for a thesis on the philosophy of science of Moritz Schlick, supervised by Ingolf Max. Since 2023, she has been employed at the mathematics department of the University of Siegen as a member of the working group History and Philosophy of Sciences, led by Gregor Nickel. In 2024, she also became a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Geneva within the project Origins of Contemporary European Thought, 1837-1938, led by Guillaume Fréchette. She is additionally a member of the junior research groups Forms of Analytical Philosophy, led by Ingolf Max, and Revisiting the History and Philosophy of Mathematics and Sciences, Women in Focus, led by Andrea Reichenberger. And today she will give a talk on Ilse Schneider's understanding of Kant and Einstein as an alternative to the realist empiricist interpretation. Thanks a lot, Julia, many thanks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to have my talk here today online. As you know, originally I have planned another talk for today, but that was should have been more focused on Einstein and Ilse Schneider. But due to family matters during the last 3 weeks, I could not find the time to prepare this completely new talk. So today I am going to hold another talk that I have originally written for Hoppers in Vienna last year. And at the end, I'm going to give you a very, very short outview on what I have been planning to talk about originally today, but really just a short outview. Today's topic, Ilse Schneider's understanding of Kant and Einstein. Ilse Schneider is not well known within contemporary philosophical discourse, but she has been recognized at least by Klaus Henschel, who commented on her in his famous and groundbreaking study on interpretations and misinterpretations of Einstein's theories. I don't know how well known this book is in the non-German world, but in German philosophy, everyone who's writing something about philosophical interpretation of the relativity theories is using this study from Henschel. So, and within this study, he commented on Schneider. He had some really short remarks on Schneider, and unfortunately, his comments on her are not very favorable. So in the first section, I will address this and attempt to show that his portrayal of Schneider is historically not that correct. And against this background, then I will present the conflict between Ilse Schneider and Hans Reichenbach, which Henschel has been commenting on within his study. And in this regard, Reichenbach can be seen as one representative of a realist empiricist interpretation of Einstein's theories that is very popular. And the second representative of this view, one I will discuss thereafter, is the also well-known interpretation of Moritz Schlick. So let us come to the first section. Ilse Schneider's early work on Kant and Einstein and how it was presented in Klaus Henschel's famous study on interpretations and misinterpretations. So the most important things on my slides are the light blue marked passages. Henschel discussed Schneider's work in the context of neo-Kantian interpretations of the theories of relativity around the 1920s. And the neo-Kantians as a group do not fare well in Henschel's study, except for Max von Laue and Ernst Cassirer, whose work he really appreciates. He presents Schneider as one of the other less acknowledged neo-Kantian philosophers. For example, he writes that in Einstein's circle of fellow physicists, there was a dominant sense of ridicule and contempt for writings such as those by Schneider or Selin. So to support this statement, he refers to some of Einstein's comments cited in an earlier chapter. However, if you look up this chapter, the only Einstein citation is the following. In a letter to Moritz Schlick from 1919, Einstein commented on the quiet, foolish dissertation by Selin. But he did not comment on Schneider's work. How does Henschel relate this to Schneider? There is a background story to this letter. Ewald Selin finished his dissertation in neo-Kantian interpretation of Einstein's theory before Schneider submitted her own dissertation and dedicated it to Einstein. For unknown reasons, he forwarded it to Einstein via Ilse Schneider, who had nothing to do with the content of Selin's book. She sent the dissertation to Einstein, and as we read in a letter from Einstein to Schneider herself, he received it and invited her to discuss Selin's work. Nothing more. And so, as you can see, Einstein was already critical of the book and even shared his thoughts about it with Schneider. So he wrote, Kant's celebrated view on time reminds me of Andersen's fairy tale of the emperor's new clothes. Only that instead of it being about the emperor's clothes, it's about the form of perception. Henschel's commentary that Schneider's work was received with ridicule and contempt by Einstein and his peers is even more irritating considering Einstein's appreciation of Schneider's work. And as shown in this letter from from the 5th of January in 1920. Here he wrote, Dear Miss Schneider, many thanks for your friendly congratulations. When is your relativized Kant coming out? I'm looking forward to it. With best regards, yours, Albert Einstein. Another interesting point in Henschel's presentation of Schneider is his citation of a letter from Arnold Berliner, the editor of the renowned volumes of Die Naturwissenschaften, to Hans Reichenbach. Berliner there wrote, we completely agree in the assessment of the little book by Ilse Schneider. And I also believe that you are right in your dissertation that Kant would prefer Schlick over Schneider. Hopefully you are aware that I'm not to blame for Ilse Schneider's work appearing in Springer's publishing house. At the time, I declined to advocate for it at Springer, but Laue did advocate for it. So Henschel suggests that Schneider's book and her subsequent works on Einstein's theories were only published because Max von Laue, a close friend of Einstein and expert on theories of relativity, had personal sympathies for Schneider and nothing more. However, it is known that von Laue genuinely appreciated Schneider's work, as did Einstein, who had many meetings and conversations with her while she was writing her doctoral thesis and remained in close scientific contact with her until the end of his life. The most interesting point about Berliner is a letter that Henschel did not cite. Just a few months before sending this critical letter about Schneider to Reichenbach, Berliner wrote to Einstein in a very different tone. He wrote that Miss Ilse Schneider wishes to see her dissertation printed and published at Springer's. I even promised her I would use my influence on Mr. Springer toward this end, but do not trust my own judgment enough, after all, to want to motivate Mr. Springer definitely into doing so. Perhaps you will be so kind as to write me a line about it, such as how you evaluate the work by Ilse Schneider against the one by Reichenbach. I myself have a very good impression of it, as far as I have read the work. But I really do not feel qualified enough to pass final judgment by myself. So one might consider that Einstein's subsequent comment on Schneider's book might not have been positive, leading to Berliner to change his mind about Schneider's book. But please remember what I said earlier. Einstein had already supported Schneider during her PhD phase and appreciated her scientific work from the beginning of her career, as well as later on. So to me, this seems not quite convincing. There is one last very interesting point in Henschel's presentation of Schneider that I want to remark on now. Reichenbach states in his book on the theories of relativity from 1921 that the profound meaning of his philosophy is that he does not simply accept the validity of the a priori laws as fact, but derives them from the possibility of experience. He comments that this sense of transcendental philosophy also eluded Ilse Schneider. So Henschel adds to this that Reichenbach writes in a footnote about Schneider that this author has not understood much about the theory of relativity, but she is at least honest in energetically rejecting the theory. So this sounds, of course, harsh, and Reichenbach is indeed critical of Schneider, which I will discuss in a few minutes. But first, let's take a closer look at Schneider's book, and we will see that Reichenbach was not as harsh and rude as Henschel presents him to be. So here on the left side, we can find the passage in Reichenbach that Henschel was writing about in his edition from 1979. So I marked here in blue the passage that Henschel cited above, where Reichenbach states that Schneider eluded the sense of transcendental philosophy. But the cited footnote can be found a passage above here marked in red. So to make it easier to read, I transcribed it here on the right side and translated it to English. Reichenbach writes that this standpoint is advocated by the radical Kantians. Here I mention Salin, Ilse Schneider, Lenore Ribke-Kühn. And as you can see, Reichenbach's footnote in question, where he writes about this author, who did not understand the theory of relativity and was rejecting it, is not, as Henschel presents, related to Ilse Schneider. It is a comment on Lenore Ribke-Kühn. So who was Lenore Ribke-Kühn? She was the editor of the Political Women's Magazine from the DMVP from 1921 onwards. She was the founder of the magazine Woman and Nation, financed by right-wing political actors, a member of the Völkische Frauenbewegung, and in 1948, she acquainted herself with Mathilde Ludendorff. So she was and has ever been a convinced Nazi. And in her very crude book on Kant contra Einstein from 1920 that Reichenbach has been citing here, she tried to refute Einstein's physical theory using Kantian philosophy. And she did it out of anti-Semitic reasons. So if Reichenbach is commenting on Ribke-Kühn that this author has not understood much about the theory of relativity, but she is at least honest in energetically rejecting the theory, we can only support this and close the chapter Lenore Ribke-Kühn. So to sum this up, of course, Reichenbach was critical of Schneider, and he's had really good reasons for this, as we will learn in a few minutes. But his critiques of her were not as harsh as Henschel presented them here. I hope to have shown within this section that Henschel's presentation of Schneider, who was one of the very few modern receptions of her early work that exists today as a whole, do not do her justice. And I hope to have justified why we should take a closer look at Schneider's early writings and her discourse with Reichenbach and Schlick during the following two sections. So let us now take a closer look at Reichenbach's comments on Schneider. The important point of his argumentation is related to what he calls the sense of transcendental philosophy. This is the point where Schneider and Reichenbach's understanding of Kantian philosophy in relation to the relativity theories seem to contradict each other. It does not lie in their understanding of Einstein's physical theories, but only in their philosophical reading of Kant. For Reichenbach, Schneider did not grasp the right sense of transcendental philosophy, which he articulated in the following way. He wrote that the profound meaning of his philosophy is that he does not simply accept the validity of the a priori laws as fact, but derives them from the possibility of experience. So, however, he overlooks that Schneider also took this aspect of transcendental philosophy into account. As she states here, Kant, in a certain sense, he knows no innate concepts, but only, like Locke, acquired ones. So, and shortly after this comment, Reichenbach reveals why he is even commenting on Schneider's book. He states that she accuses my critique of the Kantian a priori of not corresponding to the sense of transcendental philosophy emphasized by Kant. The reason for this is that she commented on his work in a footnote. There she wrote that Reichenbach's Kantian conception does not correspond to the sense of transcendental philosophy emphasized by Kant because he did not take into account the formulations of the metaphysical foundations of natural sciences, which are highly significant for the connection of the relativity theories and Kantian philosophy. And thus she concludes that there would not have been a necessity for me to deal with Reichenbach's final results. With this, her discussion of Reichenbach's work on Kant and Einstein is finished. Of course, this was a provocation for Reichenbach, and the critical comments on Schneider's book can be read as his response to it. So, and against this background, he continues, if one seeks this sense, and here he means the sense that Schneider said Reichenbach did not grasp, if one seeks the sense in her work, one finds the assertion that the general laws and the concept of the a priori are immutable. So here we have the passage that Reichenbach was referring to. And as we can see here, he is not citing her very accurately. Instead of saying that the general laws and the concept of the a priori are immutable, she states that these general laws remain no matter what kind of mathematical description is used as the basis. And the concept a priori is immutable as long as one does not want to fall victim to a fatal psychologism. Particular laws, because they concern empirically determined appearances, cannot be derived without using experience as an aid. So Reichenbach is also not taking into account the whole context and what she means by these general laws. Maybe we could discuss the details of this, in my opinion, very important as such, more closely, maybe later on, maybe in another yes, regarding the other outview in mind. So what do I here, okay. What I want to do now is to contrast Schneider's work with another representative of the realist empiricist interpretation, who also commented on her work. And this is no one other than the founder of the Vienna Circle, Moritz Schlick. But before we go to this discussion, let me give a very short overview of Schlick's interpretation of the relationship between Kantian philosophy and Einstein's physics. So, yes, okay. Schlick is rejecting Kantian transcendental philosophy in the light of the empirical establishment of the theories of relativity by Albert Einstein. But he does not provide a detailed, complete, and self-contained justification for this. However, Matthias Neubauer, who interprets Schlick's early philosophy as transcendental revisionism, provides a good overview of the reasons why Schlick is so vehemently rejecting Kantian philosophy against the background of these new physical theories. So Neubauer is giving us three reasons why philosophers like Schlick or Schlick as well as Reichenbach and others regarded Kantian philosophy as lost at the beginning of the 20th century. First, of course, we have the discovery of non-Euclidean geometry during the 19th century. But for Kant, Neubauer states, only the a priori given pure intuition can be a source of necessary and generally valid geometric knowledge. So it seems as if the existence of non-Euclidean geometry stands against this. Secondly, at the beginning of the 20th century, the axiomatization of geometry by David Hilbert using implicit definitions was published. So this contradicts the Kantian concept of pure intuition. And thirdly, the empirical establishment of the theory of relativity gives the final blow to the Kantian conception of geometry. So, and in contrast to this, Ilse Schneider states that the thesis that the Kantian concepts of space, time, and geometry are undermined by the theories of relativity must be critically questioned. And so here we have the first and only explicit reference of Schlick to Ilse Schneider's work. It is about the relatively well-known quotation of Einstein, according to which space and time completely lose their empirical objectivity. So, according to Schlick, the Kantian doctrine does justice to this only one-sided. Because with the loss of the objectivity is meant only that space and time lose their independence of the matter. However, what would then remain of the physical, spatial, and temporal would still keep the same degree of reality as this. So this is because with the loss of objectivity, Einstein meant that space and time lose their independency of matter. But what would then remain, the spatial and temporal, would still get the same degree of empirical reality as this. So at this point, Schlick refers to the fact that Einstein himself had attributed empirical reality to physical space according to general theory of relativity, but just not an independent or an own empirical reality. Schlick calls this the positive side of Einstein's space-time doctrine. Space and time are no longer forms of intuition, but they do belong to the physical determinants. And here, Schlick now directly refers to Schneider's book and claims that she misjudged this. However, Schlick seems to overlook that Schneider, at the point where she discusses exactly the same Einstein quotation, very well includes this positive side of Einstein's space-time doctrine. She remarks that only through matter physical is entering the concepts of space and time, which just shows that she does not consider them only from the negative side. And this is exactly the passage which Schlick quotes from Schneider's book itself. So Schlick further argues against Schneider that Kant's epistemology does not contradict Newtonian physics, suggesting, of course, that this is what she was claiming. But in fact, this is not something Schneider ever seriously asserted. According to her, Kant takes the position that Newton goes too far in empirically proving the existence of absolute motion. But of course, she does not claim that Kant's philosophy contradicts Newtonian physics. It was the only physics available to him. She emphasizes very clearly that Newtonian physics is not the only physics that can be reconciled with Kant's concept of space-time. What she is concerned with is to reveal the philosophical and not physical differences between the Newtonian and Kantian conceptions of space and time are demonstrable. So let me now give you a first and then a second short outview on Ilse Schneider's early work on Kant and Einstein. So the first outview, what Schneider was doing in her book, in contrast to Reichenbach and Schlick, was to differentiate between Newton and Kant. And of course, Newtonian physics have been the physical background of Kantian philosophy. But this does not mean that there exist any physical implementations in transcendentalism that are suitable to evaluate his philosophy empirical. And this is Schneider's concern, and not to give an opposite view to the theories of relativity, as she was read during this time by authors like Moritz Schlick and Hans Reichenbach. Schneider's point is just to clarify that it might be possible to develop what Einstein called relativized Kant. And this relativized Kant should be an interpretation in a way that makes his philosophy corresponding to any, especially to Einstein's physics. And to understand this, she explains, we may not only read the Critique of Pure Reason and the Prolegomena, what Reichenbach and especially Schlick did, but we must also take into account other important writings of Kant, namely the New Doctrine of Motion and Rest, as well as concerning the ultimate ground. And the most important Kantian work regarding Schneider is the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Sciences. And if we do this, Schneider states, we can come to the following conclusion. That regarding Kant's transcendental philosophy. So to make the evaluation thereof dependent on whether a Euclidean or a plurality of non-Euclidean geometries is to be used in physics for the unambiguous description of the laws of nature would be to misunderstood the sense of the Kantian doctrine completely. It would mean to look for something empirical in the pure forms of intuition, to insert into them a determination of content which Kant explicitly excluded. The fact that Kant chose his formulation as he did should leave no doubt that physics has every possibility of development. The possibility of classification remains as an invariant with respect to the change. So I do not want to decide if Schneider was right with her Kant interpretation. I'm not a Kant expert in no way. I just want to make clear that interpretations like the interpretation of Ernst Cassirer, for example, have been received very positive by authors of the realist empiricist view. And besides that, even if Schneider's interpretation was leaned against Cassirer's interpretation and has had some very similar views to him, even though it was concepted without taking this book into account that was published a few years later. There are these similarities, and it is in a way a very similar, or let me say in other words, it's very similar, but very interesting alternative interpretation to the neo-Kantian view of Ernst Cassirer. So if this was right or not doesn't count for me. It's just the historical interesting point that he was received more positive than Ilse Schneider has been, even though she was a close friend of Einstein, and their correspondence held for another 35 years. Einstein has been even supporting Schneider's work in Australia during the 1930s. So this was one outview. Another outview on what I originally wanted to talk about today is focusing a bit more on Einstein, and it's more on what do I or how is Einstein's position regarding Kantian philosophy to be understood. So in German literature, so especially in Henschel, but also in other studies, it is always suggested that Einstein has been an opponent of Kantian philosophy, mostly based on his letters to philosophers like, for example, Reichenbach and Moritz Schlick, who have been publishing opposing positions against Kantianism. But if we take into account that Einstein's correspondence with Schneider, as well as his support for her career, how does that fit if he was that a great opponent of those Kantian view or this neo-Kantian view? So I found a few months before a letter in Einstein's correspondence with Max Born. And there is an unfortunately undated letter, but it is suggested that this letter was from around 1919. And there Einstein wrote to Born, "I'm actually reading Kant's Prolegomena. It is nice to read, but not as nice as his thought leader Hume." So Einstein wrote this in 1919. Of course, we can see this seems okay. He was not that friend of Einstein on the one hand, but on the other hand, doesn't this lead us to the thought that Einstein did just not really have a good knowledge of Kantian philosophy? So he just didn't, or in other words, he did not know Kantianism or neo-Kantianism very well at that point in around 1920. And as we know, he never published on something like Kantianism. Everything, all his comments we have are only from his correspondence. So if we take this into account, as well as his staying in contact with Ilse Schneider, maybe for more than 35 years, maybe we could state that Einstein has not been such a harsh opponent of Kantian and neo-Kantian philosophy as it is always suggested. But this is really a short sketch, really just an outview on a future research topic for me. In this regard, I would like to look more for the correspondence between Schneider and Einstein during the following years, what I didn't have the time for during the last weeks. So this is just this small sketch. And so for now, I would like to thank you for the audience and the invitation again. And I'm curious for your questions.